Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Fireside Chats of Asian Pathfinders. I'm Pallavi Ade. I'm the co-founder of Asian Pathfinders, along with Shreya Deshmukh. And today we are really honored to have Ambassador Shivshankar Menon speaking with us on a very interesting topic, the prospects in 2021 for India's neighborhood first policy. But before I hand it over to Shairee, our moderator for today, for the proceedings, just a brief about Asian Pathfinders and about our upcoming sessions. So we started in 2020 at the start of the pandemic. We are a knowledge sharing platform where we aim to bring scholars, academics, practitioners to have constructive dialogues and discussions on multidisciplinary topics. We do that through our fireside chats and dialogues. And we also encourage young professionals to participate, be part of these discussions, either if they want to present with us or if they want to be moderating anything, they could just reach out to us and we'll be happy to see if we can accommodate. Again, we aim to be an informal forum, so we welcome feedback from everyone. And like I said, our work is through our fireside chats and our dialogues. So from next month onwards, we are going to change a little bit of our format. We are going to hold fireside chats and dialogues, but the fireside chats will be the first 3 or 4 Saturdays of the month, 11 to 12 p.m. Indian Standard Time. And the dialogues will be only on the last Saturday of every month. So, sorry, not the last Saturday, apologies. It's on the last Thursday of the month. The timing will remain the same, 5:30 to 7. So we do look forward to engaging with you in the coming months. So I know these are hard times, very trying times, and I know most of our audience is from India. And again, we do hope everyone is safe and healthy wherever they are. Uh, but yes, thank you so much for the support to Asian Pathfinders, even during these troubled times for not just India, but for the entire world. So, like I said, about our upcoming sessions, uh, through the month of May, we are going to hold India's sorry, discussions on India's internal security landscape, where we are going to do very special thematic sessions every week. We're starting with India's health security, the tragedy and trajectory. We have some really great experts joining us. We'll be sharing the link. I know it's not there in the chat section today, but it will definitely be on our social media pages soon. So please keep an eye on it. And on May 15th, we have Gopal Pillai, who's a former Home Secretary. He'll be speaking on India's internal security, not just the challenges, but also the successes that we've had. So all those details would obviously be on our social media pages and everything. So you can always follow us. So to keep in touch with our work. And we really, really appreciate the support we've got from the community so far. So we hope we can continue doing that. And again, like I said, community guidelines, we are a community, we are a knowledge sharing platform. So we do encourage everyone to participate, express their views through the chat section, only because we record these sessions and put it on Zoom, YouTube later. So just to reduce the noise, we say be on mute, but please put in your questions, comments in the chat section, but then respect the views of others. We all come from different walks of life, and I think we need to respect that. Again, respect intellectual property, and just like I said, never post defamatory, and we never had to remove anyone from the discussion groups, and we do hope we don't have to do that in the future. So again, you can write to me, Shreyas, or Asian Pathfinders, find us on social media. You can always send in your feedbacks, comments for our sessions. And about today's session, I think I've taken enough time so far. So without further ado, I am going to introduce Shairee Malhotra, who is the moderator for today's session. Shairee is a widely published foreign policy analyst who has worked with think tanks in Mumbai and Brussels and with the European External Action Service, the official foreign policy arm of the European Union. She has an MA in International Relations from Queen Mary University and has studied specialized courses on South Asia and Indian foreign policy from the King's College, London. She was recently chosen as a top 40 under 40 Europe-India leader by Europe's India Center for Business and Industry. Her interests involve contemporary geopolitics, IR theory, Indian foreign policy, and EU-India relations. So it's over to you, Shairee, for the proceedings. I look forward to the session.
Thank you, Pallavi, for that introduction, and thank you, Asian Pathfinders, for inviting me to moderate this very special fireside chat today. Our topic for discussion is prospects in 2021 for India's neighborhood first policy. As we know, South Asia continues to remain the world's least economically integrated region. Prime Minister Modi, therefore, at the beginning of his tenure in 2014, launched India's neighborhood first policy with a lot of fanfare, based, of course, on the rational premise that India's aspirations for global leadership as well as India's internal development really depend on how well India gets along with its neighbors. But despite India's aggressive neighborhood outreach, innovative initiatives such as the SARC satellite, several connectivity projects, there have been serious challenges, including, of course, China's expanding presence and influence in the region, fiery domestic political rhetoric, and a long-term perception of India as a regional hegemon. Instead, it often appears today that India's orientation, as well as ties with the United States and the Quad grouping, have taken priority. We have with us today a very special guest, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, one of India's most distinguished diplomats and former Foreign Secretary and National Security Advisor. Welcome to this fireside chat with me, Ambassador Menon, and many, many congratulations firstly on the release of your latest book, India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past, Present. Over to you, Ambassador, for your opening remarks on the future of India's neighborhood first policy.
Mentioned that, frankly, this is one of the least economically integrated regions or sub-regions of the world. Only about 6% of our trade is with each other. Most of our trade is actually with the rest of the world, with other people. We barely invest in each other. But, and I want to caution you here, this is if you take what the formal Westphalian state does, if you take the official figures. Our real trade with every one of our neighbors is at least 3 times more than what the official figures tell you. Because this is, and this is my first point, this is a region of porous borders. Even with Pakistan, where the relationship is so difficult, if you add what goes through Colombo, Dubai, Singapore, etc., you're doing, officially you're supposed to be doing somewhere a little less than $2 billion worth of trade. You're actually doing about 6 billion or so. That's with Pakistan. Forget about open borders like Nepal, Bangladesh, and so on. So I would be very careful accepting that as the only measure of integration. In fact, if you look at the other affinities, whether it is cross-border ethnicities, Mizos on our side are Chin on the other side. When the government of India in Delhi tells Mizoram, close the border when there's trouble in Myanmar, Mizoram says, no, we can't. And they can't because it's their own brothers, cousins, brothers-in-law, sisters-in-law, whatever. And they don't close the border. And so we have cross-border ethnicities across all these borders. And these are porous borders. The border with Bangladesh, for instance. You might say, I've built a wall, I'll do this, I'll fence, and so on. Nepal is a completely open border. There is no question. So, and if you look at in terms of every other affinity, whether it's language, culture, religion, I said ethnicity, trade also, livelihood, we are really one of the most integrated subcontinents. So you have this problem. You have new states which are in, because most of these, I mean, Pakistan's new state since 47, Bangladesh since 71. Many of the other states had sort of ambiguous relationships with the Raj, whether it's Nepal, whether it's Bhutan. And so we are in the process of actually forming new states. And in historical terms, this is relatively recent. We might be old nations, but we're new states. And so how do you build a new state? You build a sense of nationalism. How do you build a sense of nationalism? We Indians might have got independence from the British. Pakistanis got independence from us. And this is the second structural factor. India is an overwhelming, preponderant presence in their lives, in every which way. You know, and for me, my favorite example is Indians like to say to Nepalese, for instance, "Aap to bilkul hamare jaise hain." And we mean it well, right? We mean it, you're my brother. To him, it's an attack on his identity. You've just swallowed him up. Ziaul Haq was asked in the mid-80s, why are you doing Nizam Mustafa, this Islamization? And he said, look, if an Egyptian stops being a Muslim, he's still an Egyptian. If a Pakistani stops being a Muslim, he's an Indian. So there is a process of identity formation, of which in many of these countries will naturally work to complicate your life with them. And we might mean it well when we say we are the same, we want to integrate. But for them, there's a real fear of loss of identity. And that is something that we have to, so this is structural. Frankly, you can't change the fact that you're big and you are a huge culture, you have huge civilizational influence, that whether you like it or not, what a Bollywood star says becomes news in Nepal and that people react to it. Nobody in India even knew what some Bollywood star had said, but you have riots in Nepal as a consequence. So this is just a fact. And I think you need to accept these structural limitations. As I said, new states in old nations and porous borders, and this problem where, frankly, for us, whether we like it or not, we are part of their internal politics, we are part of their external politics. And when I say neighborhood, I mean including Afghanistan, including Myanmar and the Indian Ocean region, because this is geopolitically, at least this is one. The third reason why our life is getting more complicated in the neighborhood is because, frankly, during the Cold War, we were a sideshow. The primary fault line was between the US and the Soviet Union in Europe, in Germany, basically. I mean, that's where their troops confronted each other. And they had other things to do. Today, the center of global politics, center of gravity of global politics and the economy is right next to us in the Asia Pacific. Central fault line of global politics is China versus the US, their strategic competition. Economic activity, this is where it is. In fact, if you add it up, more than half the world's GDP is in Asia. Much more than half, actually. So today, you have a situation where South Asia matters because it's close to all the flashpoints. You look at what's happening around you. Why is the US talking to Nepal to join the free and open Indo-Pacific? And why is China so keen to be involved in Nepalese politics? Why over the last, if you take the period from 2016 till now, China has committed something like $100 billion worth of loans, grants, investments, etc., under BRI, but also bilaterally, to countries in South Asia. In the same period, the entire Indian investment in South Asia is $800 million. Look at the difference. So why is there this interest? Because South Asia matters today. The Indian Ocean today matters to China because her energy goes through both Hormuz and Malacca. Hu Jintao, the president, used to say China has both a Hormuz dilemma and a Malacca dilemma. And she knows that if those get closed, she has no energy. So you are today, therefore, not just because of internal structural factors in South Asia itself or in our neighborhood, but also because of global context. It's got harder. Fourth, and the last reason, and I'll stop soon, don't worry, for me is, fourth reason, unfortunately, is that in the recent past, we have exported a lot of our own confusions. We have called Bangladeshis termites, we've done, now these are, whatever our internal politics, that's our business. But unless we can separate it from our dealings with our neighbors, it becomes harder to follow a neighborhood first policy. So what should we do in this situation? My answer is when the going gets tough, you have to do more. You have to step up your game. And there's four things that I think are critical to where we are today in the neighborhood. The one thing is we certainly need to use our affinities and use our strengths. We are not great at building ports, at building infrastructure. I mean, if you get into that competition with the Chinese, I'm going to match BRI. I think that's, frankly, that's not very sensible as an approach. But you have proximity. You can do border hearts all the way across that border, create interdependence, create an interest on their part in stability, in peace, in security. You can actually open up the border areas. And are we frightened of these economies? Look at our size. Look at our capabilities. Should we be frightened of opening our economy to Sri Lanka, to Bangladesh? We need to think in terms of our strategic frontiers. And I'm not saying stop thinking about building walls at the border, because nothing today respects boundaries. In our case in South Asia, I've already explained how those boundaries, frankly, those lines are lines on a map. They're meaningless in practice. But in a globalized world, with today's technology, how can you draw these lines and say, okay, I'll keep you out? And because we cannot have islands of prosperity in South Asia. You know what will happen. We've already seen huge economic migrations. We've seen these are porous borders. You can't keep people out. You need to actually work with them and integrate the subcontinent economically. And you have the capacity to do that. That's one thing we must do. Secondly, politically, we need to make those boundaries irrelevant. But we can do that by being a net provider of security in the region to our neighbors. It's, for me, this is logical. They should look at you as a source of stability, as an answer to their security problems. Because each of them has their own issues, whether it's with maritime security, in the case of Sri Lanka and the others, or whether it is their own domestic insurgents and so on. I mean, Myanmar has a host of separatist movements, many of them actually funded or armed out of China. So there is an opportunity here to actually work with them. The third thing I would say is that we need to somehow insulate what we do in the neighborhood from our own domestic political arguments and whatever we might have to do. This is not easy. No country does that very successfully, but it can be done. We have done it in the past. When we were dealing with the LTT, for instance, it was possible to carry opinion throughout India, including Tamil Nadu, all the mainstream parties, along with our policies. And on Bangladesh, obviously, clearly everybody worked together. So it can be done. It takes a lot of hard work and a fair amount of self-restraint, but it is necessary. And I think today, especially, we need to do it. And last of all, I think we must expect that our smaller neighbors will look for external balancers against India. This is natural. Because you are such a preponderant presence in their life, and because for many of them, you represent the immediate threat to their identity, they will look for outsiders, and then they'll play you both against each other. If your relations with China are bad, they'll go to the Chinese and say, the Indians are doing this, give us something. They'll tell you, the Chinese are doing this, give us something. I mean, you did the same to the Soviet Union and the US in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So expect this and play the game. You can't exclude outside influences from your neighborhood, but you just have to step up your game and play it better. I mean, let me stop there. I've gone on long enough. I'd rather have a conversation and hear what you think we should be doing with our neighbors. Over to you, Shairee.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those very enlightening comments. So I'm going to delve straight into the discussion, and I'll kickstart by asking you firstly about the very first line in your new book, the opening line, where you say that the Indian subcontinent is the only subcontinent in the world. What implications, Ambassador, does this unique geography have on India's foreign policy prospects, particularly in the neighborhood?
Well, I think, and this is the subcontinent is a good word actually to start with, because we use the word subcontinent without meaning anything, right? our neighbors, when we say subcontinent, they hear Indian subcontinent, they hear the possessive. They think somehow now you've made it Indian. Again, so very few people use it. And then we become politically correct and stop using it. Why? Why are we ashamed of ourselves? You should stand up and say it's a geographical term. Well, it doesn't mean any ownership of anything. But the other part of this subcontinent is it's both linked. It's only part of a bigger continent, right? It's a subcontinent, so the sub part of it. So you are conscious of being part of a bigger thing, but you are unique. You are separate. So it also feeds a very strong Indian sense of exceptionalism, that nobody else is like us, we are unique, and we'll run our own affairs. And there's a strong temptation, therefore, to autarky, to building walls, to climbing back within our own little borders and taking care of our own affairs, without realizing how much we need the world, whether it is for the resources we need to transform India. Almost 50% of India's GDP today is the external sector, imports, exports, remittances, and so on. So that's not something you can just ignore. 80% of our imports are maintenance imports. We can't do without them. They're fertilizer, they're energy, oil, gas, even coal now. 25% of the coal we use, we import today. These are things that you can't just, we don't have non-ferrous metals, copper. These are basic if we're going to industrialize, if we're going to keep growing. We can't do without the world. So you might think we are unique, we are subcontinent, but I think as a result of the pattern of our development over time, when we started radical reform in 1991, only about 15.3% of GDP was external merchandise trade. By 2014, this was 49.6%. Just external merchandise trade, not counting services, not counting remittances, etc. And I think we are now, whether we like it or not, integrated into the world. And there is a real risk if we turn our back on the world and go away. And this is part of the problem. So for me, the idea that we can build fences, separate ourselves from our neighbors, lead our lives on our own. So I get nervous when self-reliance makes sense. Obviously, we need to do self-reliance. We need to industrialize ourselves. But autarky makes no sense. And my fear is that when we get too exclusive, too conscious of our uniqueness, of our exclusivity, then we shade into autarky. And we've been through that. We've been there from the second plan onwards, and we've seen what it does to us. We've seen the results, frankly. I mean, those were not glorious years, the 60s, 70s, in terms of pulling people out of poverty, in terms of our own growth, in terms of creating some capacities. It was good, but for the rest, it really wasn't. So I think, for me, therefore, when we say we're a subcontinent, I think we have to be conscious of both faces. We are part of Asia, we're part of a larger area, but we need to actually get back to that. I argue in the book, by the way, that India has been most prosperous and most advanced and most secure when she's most connected to the world, when she's most engaged with the rest of the world. But it's a long argument for that. It's 400 pages.
Right, Ambassador. But what is your audit on the Modi government's neighborhood first policy? Would you say we are closer to our neighbors today than we were in 2014 or not?
I don't think so, but I think it's partly, as I said, for the reasons I mentioned, those structural reasons. They had a hard job to do. But I do think they took their eye off the ball. And certainly some of the things they did, I mean, calling people termites, some of these were unnecessary. Sending somebody to Nepal the day after they've passed a constitution to say, change the following things in your constitution. And, this is guaranteed to fail, so it makes you look stupid, but it also creates resistance. If you want to interfere, then interfere quietly and successfully. I mean, not like this. So but some of it I would put down to learning, because they were new, they just come in and they had very strong domestic political compulsions. So I wouldn't say, oh, I think overall we have a much harder situation today in our neighborhood than we had before. But I wouldn't say it's all the Modi government's fault. Some of it is, but not all of it. And it doesn't, and as I said, if it's structural, then, you better wake up and just deal with it, because you're not going to change the structure of the world, or the fact that you are such a big country, or the fact that the center of global geopolitical gravity is next to you now, that you're caught up in other people's quarrels. All those things, I mean, frankly, it's just your skill now that's being tested.
Right. I'll move on to my next question, Ambassador. When we talk about regional integration and connectivity, how important is people-to-people engagement? Do you foresee a future where visa regulations within the region could perhaps be eased? I remember I read a Brookings study from last year that ranked India 5th amongst South Asian countries in terms of travel openness in the region. Could we perhaps do better border management that could both look after India's traditional security issues, but also allow for a more sort of relaxed flow of goods and people?
I think we need a much more open, managed flow, because otherwise what you do is you're criminalizing your border areas. By saying no trade, by closing border hearts, by not allowing free movement between people who have traditionally always their livelihoods, everything has been across the line. I mean, these are brand new lines, as I said, and they're artificial lines and they're porous. What are you doing? You're making normal trade smuggling. So you're putting him in the hands of criminals who can then protect him. When you say no travel, so then it becomes people trafficking, smuggling, illegal immigration. These things, there is a point beyond which you cannot fight gravity or the laws of economics and politics. And you need to actually manage this properly and channel it in a positive direction. And you can do it. A lot of this trade that I said is illegal, this 2/3 of the real trade. Why isn't it legal? Government would be making money out of it. The economy would benefit from it, and you'd stop this. And for me, this is really worrying. It affects our security, the criminalization of our borders. Because the more you lay down rules that you can't enforce and so on, you're handing over not just that, but even your border forces get corrupted if they stay in one place for too long. Because the temptation then is for them to form a local nexus and so on. And this is not a good situation for you, or you, not just as a state, but as a nation, as a country. Also, look at what it does to your relationship with your neighbors, because then all that they see is enforcement. So yes, I think, and unlike the rest, we don't have to encourage people-to-people relations. People-to-people relations exist already. Unfortunately, by taking this sort of Western Westphalian idea of the state and its responsibilities and its duties, we've actually criminalized what is normal daily life for most people. And so for me, it's more a question of changing our attitude to how we deal with it. People to people will happen anyway. The best measure, if you look at remittances between India and Bangladesh, India and Bhutan, India and Nepal, clearly, there is much more movement going on than the official figures will tell you. You're talking about figures, annual remittances from India to Bangladesh of about $9 billion. From Bangladesh to India, annual remittances, these are private individuals, of around $2.5 to $3 billion. These are fairly sizable sums, which means there are people living, working, sending money home, doing the normal things that people do. And yet, if you ask what are the figures, how many people are living and working here, they don't support these kinds of figures. So this is why I say you need to be careful with the figures that you're told and the levels when people tell you there's no integration in South Asia. I actually think there is much more integration. It's just that we're criminalizing it, or we're just ignoring it and turning a blind eye to it.
Ambassador, I'm going to move on to a question from the audience. Ayushi Jain asks, should we focus on reviving SAARC or BIMSTEC? And how can we change our image as big brother in the region? I'm just going to add a little bit on my own here. We know that in the region, the focus is still very much on bilateral relationships in the neighborhood and not so much on strengthening regionalism as such. So again, is there potential to revive SAARC? And if there is focusing mainly on economic and social progress within SAARC enough, or do we dare to go beyond and perhaps address issues that are common to many of our countries, issues that don't respect boundaries, such as maritime security, global terrorism?
Well, if SAARC has a very clear mandate, it can only do social, economic, it can't do the politics. And the problem is the politics. After all, it's not that we don't have the instruments. We have, thanks to SAARC, we have a South Asia free trade agreement. But without political will, there are countries who don't implement it, like Pakistan. So the problem is a political problem at core. And it's not just India, Pakistan, because frankly, nothing in SAARC prevents any three members from cooperating and doing something under SAARC. Nowhere does it say that everybody has to do everything. So if you wanted to, you can happily use SAARC and work it. But I think we find the whole multilateral business much too complicated for ourselves. Our smaller neighbors find some comfort in the idea that it's not just them alone against the colossus. But from our point of view, I think we find it easier to do it bilaterally and so far. But luckily, I think for the last decade or so, we've said we don't care what the means. You want to do it in SAARC, do it in BIMSTEC, do it in any other forum that you want. That's only a tool. That's only the means. The important thing is to get it going. And if you look at it, electricity trade across borders with Nepal, with Bangladesh, we're now talking about doing that with Sri Lanka as well. You look at the movement of goods across these borders, much easier today than it was 10 years ago. What's missing, of course, is movement of people or a managed way of handling the movement of people, partly because it's become domestically complicated within both sides. I mean, it's not only an Indian problem, it's also a problem on the other side. But I think if we concentrate on that, making customs procedures much easier, for instance, making sure that vehicles can actually cross borders rather than having to transship everything from one truck to another at every border crossing. Simple things like that. If we concentrated on those, just documentation, making sure we can do it electronically across the region, and anybody who wants to join should be free to join. If Pakistan wants to opt out, that's their business. But those who want to, who see advantage in it, and I think if we took the lead in those kinds of practical steps, rather than in grand declaratory statements saying we're going to integrate our economies, which sounds like I'm going to swallow you up. Instead, if it becomes, it's going to be easier for you to ship things from Calcutta to Kathmandu, and you don't have to transship it 3 times. If you bring it through Bangladesh, you don't have to shift, etc. If you can do simple things like that, I think we can do a great deal to integrate the region. Whether we do it through SAARC or through, BIMSTEC, that frankly, these are all platforms. And unfortunately, leaders like these grand platforms where they can perform for the public. But those platforms are only as effective as the actual practical cooperation that you put in place. And the best example for me here is what we have done with Bangladesh since Sheikh Hasina's visit in 2010. And if you look at what we've done steadily since then, in terms of inland waterways, in terms of electricity, in terms of transit, every which way, it's quite remarkable what we have managed to achieve, doing simple, concrete things, building Ashuganj port, clearing, desilting parts of the Feni River. These are not grand, and they don't frighten people either.
Ambassador, there's a couple of questions pertaining to Pakistan. Some inevitable questions have come up. So I'm going to tie them all in together. Sumalata Chaitanya has asked about Pakistan. Parimal Sudhakar has mentioned Pakistan. So, there's been a lot of talk about this so-called thaw in India-Pakistan relations recently that's being allegedly brokered by the UAE government. What would you say are the underlying reasons for this thaw, and why now? Are there domestic compulsions involved for both sides? Could this perhaps be the resumption of the restart of a comprehensive dialogue with Pakistan? How skeptic should we be, and how optimistic should we dare to be?
Yeah, it's a hard question actually, because there is no simple answer. But at least if you look back over history, Pakistan comes to the table in two circumstances. One is when she has no choice, like Musharraf in 2003, 2004, after the build-up on the border, the attack on parliament, build-up on the border, Parakram, etc., and tremendous US pressure on Pakistan because they were in Afghanistan. They'd just gone in, thrown out the Taliban. So that's one circumstance. The other is when they think you're in trouble, you're under pressure. After the 62 war, by March, Bhutto, the foreign minister, is here talking to Swaran Singh about Kashmir, and he's trying his luck. He goes through 4 big rounds, he tries, but he overreaches. He demands up to the Chenab for some kind of Kashmir settlement. Ziaul Haq, 87, 88, when he thinks that he has US support, thanks to the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan, he sees a young, inexperienced Indian Prime Minister, he tries his luck. So he comes to Jaipur to watch a cricket match, etc. Today, Pakistan is not in such a bad position. She has solid Chinese support, much more so than she's had for many years before. So they see your relations with China are in crisis since last year on the border. So why not come and see what happens, what they can get. It's opportunist. You might say this is terrible and so on, but that's the way politics is. Why not? And if we can get something that we want out of it, good. If we can neutralize to some extent, at least, our problem, our two-front problem, why not? So we've got a ceasefire, good thing. People at least people who live near the line, their lives are much easier. Weddings have started again, etc. But we have to see. And I wouldn't start by saying, oh, therefore everything's going to be solved and now everything's wonderful. We've been through this dance before. We know the steps, both sides. We're very good at this dance. But fundamentally, to me, it seems that those in power on both sides have an interest in a controlled, managed level of hostility. It suits their domestic political purposes. And I don't think either side's politics can support a grand bargain, a grand unification, a settlement of everything. And, I don't see that coming. I don't see it right now. Because I don't think domestic politics in either country can support that. So either the institutional interest of the Pakistan army or whatever, there's a whole host of reasons. So I would keep my expectations low, but I'd say, here's an opportunity. Let's see what we can get out of it, how far we can take this to improve the lives of our people and, maybe bring some measure of rationality back into the relationship. Because not talking at all and so on doesn't make sense to me. And for me, I go back to first principles. We have enemies in Pakistan and they're in power. Pakistan Army, the jihadis, and so on, ISI. But we don't have enemies among the ordinary people, among Pakistani business who can actually do well out of dealing with you, or with several civilian politicians who maybe are weather vanes, will go whichever way the wind is blowing, but but there are those who actually put themselves out, like Nawaz Sharif, to try and improve the relationship with India. So given that situation, I think we need to actually, rather than drive them all together behind our enemies and uniting them, I think we need to allow a certain amount of travel, a certain amount of business, at least split the neutrals from your enemies. For me, that would be a sensible approach, and then see what you can get out of this. this thaw, as it were.
Ambassador, you mentioned how the domestic politics in both countries sometimes doesn't allow for things to progress. For example, in Pakistan, the Pakistan army, but I also want to ask you about what about ordinary citizens? How much does the buy-in of ordinary citizens matter to the growth of a particular relationship? For example, if you look at Bangladesh, at the highest levels where foreign policy is conducted, we've always had good relations with Bangladesh. But if you look at the people of Bangladesh, there's always been a slightly negative sentiment, perhaps from them emanating towards India. I remember when I was studying in the UK, and whenever there'd be an India-Pakistan cricket match, you'd always have the Bangladeshi students turn up wearing green, which obviously to me came as a huge shock when I was studying there because I wasn't expecting that. So how much really does it matter, especially in democratic countries, where leaders have to fight elections and especially since the discourse in all of our countries has become so sensationalist, overly nationalistic, emotionally charged?
I think we have to recognize that today, unlike in 1971, Pakistan is far away from Bangladesh. You are a permanent presence in their lives. Today, it's your overwhelming presence that is a fact in their lives. And that for a very long time, there have been very strong attempts in Bangladesh to try and build a sense of Bangladeshi nationalism on religion and as separate from India somehow. As against that, there are three things which I think separate Bangladesh fundamentally from what Pakistan is. They have a very strong Bengali identity, as opposed to, they don't need to therefore use political Islam as the basis of national identity. They have a very strong Bengali identity. They have very strong mass-based political parties which are secular in their approach, which again, in Pakistan, those parties were eliminated over the 50s and early 60s very quickly. And most important, I think you have a history which you can actually build on. It's not that all Bangladeshis somehow would support Pakistan in a cricket match. No. There are those who would and there are those who wouldn't. And I think what, Joe and I used to tell Chinese diplomats in the 50s before sending them out, when you go there, decide who is with you, who is against you, and who is neither with you nor against you. You spend 10% of your effort on those who are with you. Spend another 10% of your effort on those who are against you. But the bulk of your effort should be on those who are neither with you nor against you. And that is the bulk of Bangladesh. You need to actually go out there and prove to them that you represent a safe, secure, prosperous future for them. And if you look at Bangladesh's choices over the last 50 years, actually, here's a country who Kissinger wrote off as a basket case. And today they have a per capita income which is at least equal to India's. Their per capita income is much higher than Pakistan's. I mean, they've done well economically. You look at their growth rates, you look at their degree of integration with the world economy and how well they've done. They've really, look at all their social indicators. They're among all of us South Asians, they're doing much better than us. They're certainly better than Pakistan. They're almost close to Sri Lankan levels, Sri Lankan or Bhutanese levels, actually. So they've got their priorities right. And I think we need to look at that and look at what we've done bilaterally together with them. So it's not only working with one party or with one leadership. I think we need to actually make sure that our policies actually get through to everybody else. And that we can do. And that's why I think all this opening border hearts, doing the nitty-gritty of the relationship is important, because that involves everybody else in the relationship.
Right. I'll move on to the next question from the audience. Abhishek Pandey and Emi Thaba, they both asked about Myanmar. So Abhishek Pandey asked, given the increasing complexities in Myanmar and India's internal engagements due to COVID, if China looks for active involvement in Myanmar, where does India stand? And I'll just tie that in with Emi Thaba's question. Talking about the refugee influx from Myanmar to India, as you mentioned, the ethnic connection in both countries, it's normal for refugees and migrants to not be identified in India due to help from their fellow tribesmen in India to the extent of obtaining Indian identity cards. In such a porous border, it's almost impossible to record each and every migrant. How should the government approach this problem?
Well, as for China, China is and has always been a presence in Myanmar. So it's not if China comes, what happens? And right from day one, when the Kuomintang armies, when they were pushed out of China by the communists, they then spent the next 20 years actually in northern Burma and fighting the communists. Then the Communist Party of Burma, supported by the Chinese. Chinese have supported ethnic insurgencies. They've been involved in Myanmar every which way, right through. Frankly, we have been involved in our own way because we also have similar problems. Like the Chinese, we have Nagas on both sides of the line, which is why, if you look at NSCN-K, for instance, most of their support came from on the Myanmarese side. And we worked with the Myanmarese authorities, with the Myanmar army, and even with groups within Myanmar. And we've operated across with their permission and so on. So China is a presence. China, in fact, brokered and has been trying to run a process of talks between when Myanmar started democratization under the last government. They actually brokered the talks between the various separatist groups and the insurgent groups and the central government of Myanmar. When the Rohingya crisis erupted and refugees were pushed across into Bangladesh, it was China which offered to mediate talks between Bangladesh and Myanmar. My own sense, frankly, is that that was an instance of our taking our eye off the ball. We should have been there saying, you're both our friends, we want to help you solve this problem. Rather than saying all Rohingyas are terrorists and we're going to lock them up and we'll push them back across the border. There is no security solution to what is ultimately a political, social problem in both countries. And so, frankly, you might catch one or two and push a few, people across, and these will probably be the ones who can't take care of themselves, who therefore get caught. But this is not, you cannot securitize your Myanmar policy, and you cannot deal with refugees and purely as a security problem. It is a security problem, and it'll get much worse the more you deal with it as a security problem. But you need to actually find ways of dealing with it. What's the ideal solution for refugees from Myanmar? Of course, to create conditions in Myanmar for their safe and peaceful return, which is what you did in the case of Bangladesh when you had 10 million refugees. But you did manage to keep track of most of them. Yes, there was some leakage, but you did. Ultimately, 10 million of those people did actually go back to Bangladesh after 71. You have handled very large numbers of refugees in the past. You've handled up to 250,000 Tibetan refugees. You've handled Sri Lankan refugees in roughly the same numbers, around 200,000 or so, and all in relatively short periods of time. So this idea that somehow our state is incapable, we don't know, they hide, they get lost, that's just not true. I don't know. I come from a village in Kerala, and if anybody new comes into our village, we know. But you can't deal, but we're not going to tell every policeman who comes by and asks us who it is in the village. If you have social policing, if you have community policing, which is what you should be doing, frankly, many of these problems you can actually handle. So for me, therefore, we need a mixed sort of approach to this refugee problem. And we need an approach which offers a solution at the end of it, not just to us, but to the Myanmaris, to the Bangladeshis as well. I don't think as for China's presence, it's a fact of life. China will have influence, but the more China interferes or gets involved, the more the Myanmarese reaction against it. And this is one reason why we have actually worked so well with any regime in Myanmar. It doesn't matter whether it was the Tatmadaw whether SLOC, as it used to be called, whether it's the army, whether it's the democratic regime. We've worked together because Myanmar doesn't want to be entirely a Chinese client state. They have a very strong urge to independence. And that same urge that we're talking about in our neighbors, which for external balancing, that's as true there as well. And we can work with it. And it actually gives us opportunities if we open our minds a little bit and actually stop looking at it purely as a policeman would.
Ambassador Menon, another question from the audience that I'm picking up. Anidrisha Hazarika asks, how do you view India's Indo-Pacific strategy? Will our sub-region find its space in this leading geopolitical calculus? And if I can add to that, does India's orientation towards the US and the Quad come at the cost of our neighborhood policy? And is there a trade-off in these priorities, or are these multiple orientations, synchronous with each other?
Well, the Indo-Pacific, for me, this is important, the Indo-Pacific, because as I said, if half your GDP is the external sector and over 93% of your trade actually goes by sea, then the security of these sea lanes really matters. And therefore, you need a strategy to at least ensure the safety and security of the sea lanes which carry your trade. In 1991, most of your trade went west through Suez. Now, about 38% of your trade goes through the South China Sea, goes east, because that's where the big destinations are for your trade today. So you now have an interest, a core interest actually, in the safety, security of these sea lanes which run or right through the Indo-Pacific. But the Indo-Pacific is not the entire answer to your problems. You are also a continental power, and you have the world's largest boundary dispute with China. And that problem is not solved at sea. That problem you have to solve at land. So you, unlike the other members of the Quad, who are basically islands in geopolitical terms, I mean, the US is behind the two largest oceans of the world, Australia, Japan, they can be offshore balancers. They can intervene when it suits them. They can go home when they don't want to get involved. You are involved, whether you like it or not. You're on the Asian continent. This is why when we started by saying we're a subcontinent, we're still sub. So what happens in Asia matters to us. What happens in Afghanistan matters to us. Quad, Indo-Pacific is no answer for this, for our boundary dispute, for our issues here. Does it affect our ability to manage our relationships within the subcontinent? It doesn't have to, because frankly, the only great power which objects to your dealings with your neighbors is China, which has consistently commented on what you do in Nepal, what you do with Pakistan, what you do in Sri Lanka, and so on. But the rest of the world is quite happy as long as they don't see the subcontinent as getting in their way. And to the extent that for the US, for instance, if your relations with China are bad, then clearly the more influence you have in the subcontinent, the better from their point of view, because their biggest worry is a Chinese gain in the subcontinent. So for them, they see you as a countervailing power rather than, and for them, that's useful. So for me, actually, today you have the space, but that space will not last forever. If this becomes an area of contention between China and the US, or if other geopolitical factors start making you more important, if, for instance, the sea lanes that run through the Indian Ocean, which carry all the oil that we use, that China uses, Japan uses, if those sea lanes start getting interrupted, if there are blockages, if there are threats to that, then you will see the rest of the world getting involved in your neighborhood. Because as I said, I define neighborhood as not just subcontinent, but the Indian Ocean region. So there are several conditions in which that could happen. And it depends on how well you manage these relationships. But today you have the space, you have the ability, and you should actually be out there doing a much more active neighborhood policy. But as I said, the prospects are tough, It's not going to be easy.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we're almost running out of time, so I'm going to take one or two last questions from the audience. At least three people have asked about Afghanistan. Vineet R, Tanishq Saxena, Parimal Sudhakar, they've all mentioned Afghanistan. So I'll take Tanishq Saxena's question. He asks, what would the US withdrawal from Afghanistan mean for India? What would be its implications on Indian external and internal security?
Well, let's say the US withdraws, which now they've said they will quite soon. They've been saying they will for some time, since 2008. But anyway, now I think it looks like they really will. 4 or 5 things happen. Internally, clearly, there will be a struggle for power within Afghanistan, most likely violent. They've gone through it before, but ultimately it's the Afghans who are going to decide who holds power and how it's distributed in Afghanistan. Maybe it goes back to the traditional pattern of a weak Kabul, of power with various regional landlords and so on. Secondly, US dependence on Pakistan diminishes radically. She no longer then needs Pakistan in order to sustain her presence in Afghanistan, or as a possible broker, intermediary towards the Taliban and other people whom she's negotiating with. So Pakistan's utility to the US drops immediately. Thirdly, if there's trouble, radicalization, etc. in Afghanistan, first impact is on Pakistan and the other immediate physical neighbors. So those neighbors will have to step up. So far, they've been comfortable hiding behind US troops are doing their work for them. And they can afford to posture and support their proxies and do whatever they want. But when the rubber hits the road, once the US withdraws, they will have to make up their minds how they deal with it. Whether it's the Chinese with Xinjiang and Uyghur separatists finding bases in Afghanistan, whether it's Baloch separatists, which affects both Pakistan and Iran, whether it's the radicalization of the Pathans, because it's the same Pathans across the Durand line on both sides, all the way up to the Indus and beyond actually now. So they will have to recalculate. And frankly, for me, I think the real threat is to Pakistan. Don't forget, it's not Afghanistan being Pakistanized, it's Pakistan being Talibanized that we are dealing with as a phenomenon here. Now, is that good or bad for us? I'm not getting into that. But that's the way I see the immediate consequences. So I've been saying for some time, quite frankly, that if the US is to go, they should just get up and go. Because they haven't fought the Taliban for a long time. They haven't been doing real counterinsurgency for many years. They're down now to 3,500 troops. They're spending their time protecting themselves. So it's time, if they want to go, then please go. And we'll deal with the consequences. And then I think you will see things shaking out quite differently and different countries working with each other to at least hold the ring. People will try and interfere in Afghanistan, but the Afghans have enough experience of handling outside powers. And everyone who's got into Afghanistan has burnt their fingers. It doesn't matter whether it was the British, the Soviets, the Americans, the Pakistanis. It doesn't matter who it is. Some people say, oh, the Chinese will march in, they have the money and so on. Let's see. I mean, this is the graveyard of empires. And it will stay that way. So for me, I would say as India, we don't have an Afghan problem. We have a Pakistan problem. All these terrorists that we catch are Pakistanis, they're not Afghan. We've had one Afghan in 40 years. So for me, therefore, I would say, let the Americans go and we'll deal with the consequences. We'll work with whoever we can work with in Afghanistan and around Afghanistan.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was really interesting, especially the part where you say it's Pakistan that's been Talibanized, not the other way around. That's very interesting. I'm going to remember that one. Do we have time for just one final question, Ambassador?
Sure.
I'd like to ask you about the vaccine diplomacy. You know, India has, of course, been conducting intense vaccine diplomacy across the neighborhood and, in fact, throughout the pandemic, we've been conducting what's been called COVID diplomacy by sending PPE gear and other necessary things to countries around the neighborhood. Would you agree then that India has made good use of the opportunities that the pandemic has provided to bolster its clout in the neighborhood? And do you also think this very sad situation and, you know, the global headlines on the current calamity that's unfolding in India as we speak will eclipse some of what we may have gained in the neighborhood?
You know, I've said it before that these are not things that you do in the expectation of, oh, people will be grateful, they'll love us forever. How many Indians remember that we feed ourselves because the Americans helped us with the Green Revolution? There's no gratitude, and certainly they might have helped you with the Green Revolution. Within 3 years, your relations were at the pits. I mean, you know, in 71, you had the Enterprise, and you spent decades after that at each other's throat. So I don't think we should engage in vaccine diplomacy and so on in the expectation that this is some big diplomatic gain or we're going to gain some gratitude and brownie points in the world and so on. No, we should do the right thing. And I think what we've done so far is the right thing. When we have domestic needs, we take care of our own people. When we can, we help the others. And we've made very constructive suggestions. Most of all, that they need to waive the IPRs and deal with it the way we dealt with HIV/AIDS drugs and medication, and make it available to people at a price that they can afford, so that we limit the pandemic. And the only answer that anybody has today is vaccines. And we can make a contribution, and we should go out and do it, because frankly, it's a way of defending ourselves. It's not just a way. So when we help to vaccinate our neighbors, for instance, who don't have the production capacity, I see it as being in our self-interest. And I think that's why we should go out, not in the expectation that, oh, everybody is going to love me after this and everything will be wonderful. No, frankly, our own history tells you that that's not the way politics works or international relations work. And I think we should tone that down. I think the problem here today is that, you know, frankly, it doesn't matter whether it's India, the US, Europe, you know, the pandemic is being used for domestic political gain. And everybody is ready to claim credit of any kind. But the moment anything goes wrong, not my fault, somebody else did it, right? It's a Chinese virus, it's somebody else did. So if we're going to keep playing politics as usual, then why do we expect better results than politics has produced so far? Sorry, on that downer.
Well, we've managed to cover immense ground with you, Ambassador. We've just about gone over time. So thank you so much for this very eye-opening session and leaving us all with a lot of food for thought. Congratulations once again, Ambassador, on the launch of your new book. I'm very much looking forward to picking up my own copy and getting cracking on it, as I'm sure it'll dwell on many of the themes we've discussed in even greater depth and more. Thank you, Asian Pathfinders and the founders Pallavi and Shreyas for organizing these wonderful sessions where we can all learn so much from each other and, you know, grow from the knowledge of our esteemed guests. Pallavi, Shreyas, would you like to have a word?
Yes. Thank you, Shairee, and thank you for that excellent moderation. I think you kept the discussion very engaging and we're really sorry we couldn't take all the questions, because I know there was a flurry of questions and unfortunately time, but definitely, like Shairee said, Sir's books and his writings will give you a lot of more understanding on these topics. So reach out to those writings, and definitely it's always great to hear, Sir. And I think thank you so much, Sir, for coming today and, you know, sparing your time. And I know we've been discussing with Sir and we finally found the time after long, but yeah, we're really glad this happened. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward to your participation in our future sessions. Have a good weekend and please stay safe.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Shairee.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Shairee. Thank you for making it so easy. And thank you, Pallavi and Shreyas. Thanks for organizing this. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. It was wonderful talking to you.
Everyone, stay safe.
You too.